The evening air was thick with the scent of rain, the streets of the city shimmering beneath the soft glow of streetlights. John Blake, dressed in his tailored suit, walked briskly down the avenue, his mind occupied with the usual cacophony of business deals and board meetings. It was his routine, his way of numbing the pain that gnawed at him every day. The pain of not knowing what had happened to his daughter, Emily, 10 years ago. He paused briefly at a street vendor selling roasted chestnuts, the warm, nutty aroma breaking through his haze of thoughts. Just as he reached into his pocket for change, a voice called out from behind him, "John Blake." He froze. It wasn't the name itself that made him stop, it was the voice. Raspy and hoarse, like someone who hadn't spoken in days. He turned slowly, his eyes narrowing at the sight of a woman standing a few feet away. Her clothes were worn, tattered, and she looked out of place amidst the bustling city. Her hair, streaked with gray, hung in tangled waves around her face, and her eyes, those intense, piercing eyes, were fixed squarely on him. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice more cautious than curious. She stepped closer, ignoring the people who brushed past her in the busy street. "I know about Emily." John's heart skipped a beat. Emily. The name hit him like a punch to the gut. For a moment, it felt as though time slowed, the noise of the city fading into the background. How could this woman, this stranger, know about his daughter? "You're mistaken," he said firmly, trying to steady his voice, but his pulse quickened. "I don't know what you're talking about." The woman smiled faintly, as though she had expected his denial. She reached into the pocket of her oversized coat and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. Her hand trembled slightly as she extended it toward him. "She's not lost forever," the woman whispered, her voice carrying a weight that made John's skin prickle. "You can still save her, but you need to act fast." John stared at the paper, his hand frozen midair. He didn't want to believe her. He couldn't. But the way she spoke, the conviction in her voice, clawed at the fragile hope he had buried deep inside. For 10 years, he had clung to the belief that his daughter was alive, even though every investigation, every lead had led to nothing. "What do you mean?" His voice wavered as he finally took the note. "How do you know anything about Emily?" The woman glanced around, her eyes scanning the crowd nervously. "I can't say more here. They're watching. Just," she gestured to the paper in his hand, "meet me tomorrow at the old bridge, the one on the outskirts of the city. You remember it, don't you?" John's chest tightened. The bridge. The place where Emily had disappeared 10 years ago, without a trace. His grip on the note tightened, his mind racing. "Why should I believe you?" he demanded, trying to mask the tremor in his voice. "Who are you?" The woman's lips curled into a sad smile. "I'm someone who can help you, but only if you're willing to believe that not everything is as it seems." She took a step back, her gaze softening. "Be there, John. It's your only chance." Without another word, the woman disappeared into the crowd, swallowed by the throng of people bustling along the sidewalk. John stood there, rooted to the spot, the note clutched tightly in his hand. For a long moment, he didn't move. His mind swirled with doubt, anger, and a glimmer of hope he didn't dare acknowledge. He glanced down at the crumpled piece of paper in his hand, hesitating before unfolding it. There were just 2 words, scribbled hastily. "She's waiting." John's breath hitched. He stared at the note, his heart pounding against his ribs. Could this be real? Could Emily, his Emily, truly still be alive? The rational part of him screamed that it was a cruel trick, some scam designed to exploit his grief. But another part of him, a part that hadn't been silenced in a decade, begged him to follow the lead. Tomorrow, the old bridge. He slipped the note into his jacket pocket and began walking again, though his steps were slower, his mind heavy with questions. The city lights blurred around him, and for the first time in years, John allowed himself to feel something other than numbness. As he walked toward his penthouse, the streets around him fading into the shadows of night, John Blake's heart carried a fragile hope, a hope that maybe, just maybe, his daughter was out there somewhere, waiting for him. And tomorrow, he would find out the truth. John Blake sat at his desk, staring blankly at the family photo on the polished wood. His late wife, Laura, beamed in the picture, her arms wrapped around their daughter Emily, who was just a child then. It was taken a year before the nightmare began, before Emily vanished without a trace. He exhaled heavily, rubbing his temples. The mysterious woman's words from the night before echoed in his mind. She's not lost forever. Those words had haunted him all night. He hadn't slept. Could she be telling the truth? Or was it another dead end in a decade-long chase that had consumed him? He glanced at the clock. It was nearly noon. The meeting at the old bridge was only hours away, but uncertainty gnawed at him. Over the years, he had been led down countless false paths. Con men, fake ransom demands, supposed witnesses, all promising answers about Emily's fate. Every one of them had ended in heartbreak. John stood up, pacing across his sleek, minimalist office. The view of the city skyline through the floor-to-ceiling windows usually brought him a sense of accomplishment. But now, it felt hollow, like the empire he had built was a distraction from his own failures. The millions he had spent, the people he had hired to find Emily, none of it had brought her back. Why was this woman any different? A knock on the door broke his train of thought. It was his assistant, Claire, holding a thick folder of reports. "Mr. Blake, your noon meeting is in 20 minutes, Claire said, her tone professional as always, but with a hint of concern in her eyes. "Shall I let them know you'll be joining via video?" John waved her off. "Cancel it." "Cancel it?" Claire raised an eyebrow, clearly taken aback. John never canceled meetings, especially not ones of this magnitude. "I said cancel it. I'm dealing with something important." Claire hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Of course, Mr. Blake," she said, quietly closing the door behind her. John returned to his desk, pulling the small, folded note from his jacket pocket. He had read it so many times that the edges had started to fray. "She's waiting." 2 simple words, but they were enough to make his hands tremble. His heart told him to follow the lead, but his mind was screaming not to let hope cloud his judgment again. Before he could spiral any further, his phone buzzed on the desk. He glanced at the screen and froze. It was an unknown number. With a steadying breath, he answered. "John Blake?" The voice on the other end was distorted, like it had been run through some sort of audio filter. "Who is this?" John demanded, his grip tightening on the phone. "Someone who knows the truth about Emily." John's stomach knotted. "What do you want?" "I want you to come to the bridge. Alone. No police, no security. Or you'll never find out what happened to your daughter." The line went dead. John slammed the phone down, his heart racing. Whoever this was, they were serious. It couldn't be another scam. They had mentioned Emily specifically, but how much could he trust them? He had been careful, very careful, with information about Emily's case. Almost nothing had been made public after the initial media storm faded. John sat back in his chair, staring at the ceiling, his thoughts tangled in a web of fear and hope. If this lead turned out to be another dead end, it would break him. He didn't know how much more disappointment he could bear. His thoughts drifted back to that day 10 years ago, the day Emily disappeared. She had been playing near the bridge while John took a business call. It was only for a few minutes, but when he returned, she was gone. The memory seared itself into his mind like a brand, a constant reminder of his failure. A sudden knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. It was Claire again. "Mr. Blake, there's something else? A letter arrived for you this morning." She stepped in, holding a plain white envelope. "There's no return address." John took the envelope from her, feeling a cold chill creep down his spine. He dismissed Claire with a nod and tore the envelope open. Inside was a single sheet of paper, typed in bold letters. "If you want to know the truth, follow the woman." John's hands shook as he read the words. Was this a warning or a threat? And who was this woman really? The clock on his desk ticked relentlessly, reminding him that the time for the meeting was drawing closer. He didn't have a choice anymore. He needed to go. The bridge had been the scene of his worst nightmare, but now, it could be the place that finally brought him peace, or the truth. He grabbed his coat and headed for the door, his mind racing with a mixture of fear, hope, and the desperate need for answers. Emily was out there. He could feel it. And if this woman really had the answers, he would stop at nothing to find them. The wind howled through the trees as John Blake pulled up to the old, abandoned bridge, its rusted iron frame looming against the darkening sky. He killed the engine and sat there for a moment, gripping the steering wheel, his knuckles white with tension. The memories of that day came flooding back. Emily's laughter, the sun shining on her blonde curls as she played by the water's edge, and the hollow silence when he returned, only to find her gone. John shook his head, forcing the memory back. He wasn't here to relive the past. He was here to confront it. The bridge had long been out of use, a relic from another era, now standing as a forgotten monument on the edge of town. Over the years, it had become a painful symbol of his failure. But tonight, it was the place that might finally give him the answers he'd been searching for. As he stepped out of the car, a cold gust of wind hit him, chilling him to the bone. He glanced around, the area deserted except for the rustle of leaves and the distant sound of the river flowing beneath the bridge. The sky was growing darker, heavy clouds gathering as if the weather itself was reflecting the storm brewing inside him. He checked his watch. The woman should be here by now. John's pulse quickened, his mind racing with doubts. What if this was a setup? What if this woman had no information about Emily and was leading him into a trap? His instincts as a businessman told him to leave, to avoid unnecessary risks. But his heart, the part of him that still believed Emily might be alive, told him to stay. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the shadows at the far end of the bridge. John's breath caught in his throat as the woman from the street slowly approached. She looked just as disheveled as before, her coat flapping in the wind, her eyes sharp and alert. For a brief moment, John wondered if she was some kind of ghost, a figure from the past sent to torment him. She stopped a few feet away from him, her expression unreadable. Neither of them spoke for a moment, the air between them thick with unspoken tension. "You came," she finally said, her voice barely louder than the wind. "I don't have time for games," John replied, his voice firmer than he felt. "You said you knew something about Emily. If you're lying to me, I swear." "I'm not lying," she interrupted, her gaze intense. "I know where she is." John's heart lurched. He took a step closer, his eyes narrowing. "Where? Tell me where she is." The woman didn't flinch. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out an old, faded photograph, holding it out to him. John hesitated for a second before snatching it from her hand. His breath caught in his throat. It was Emily. The girl in the photo was older, much older than the 7-year-old he had last seen. But there was no mistaking those eyes, that smile. She looked to be in her late teens now, standing against a brick wall in an unfamiliar place. The picture had been taken recently. He could tell by the date scribbled in the corner, just 2 years ago. John's hands trembled as he stared at the photo. Emily was alive. "Where is this?" he demanded, his voice breaking. The woman stepped closer, lowering her voice. "She's being held somewhere. Somewhere far from here, in a facility. They've kept her hidden for years, but I know how to find her. I was one of them once." John's blood ran cold. "One of who?" "A group," she said, glancing nervously around as if someone might be watching. "They took her. She was part of something bigger than you realize. But I got out. I couldn't live with it anymore." John's mind raced. A group? A facility? He had always assumed Emily's disappearance was the work of some deranged kidnapper or a random tragedy. But this? It was far more sinister than he could have imagined. "Why are you telling me this now?" he asked, his suspicion returning. "Why after all these years?" The woman's eyes softened. "Because I couldn't live with the guilt any longer. I didn't take her, but I was part of it. I know what they did to her. I know where she is. But you need to be careful. They're still watching you. They're watching everything." John's mind spun with 100 questions. "Where is she? Tell me." The woman looked away, as if struggling with some inner turmoil. "I can't give you everything. Not yet. They'll know if I tell you too much at once. But I can give you a starting point." She reached into her coat again and pulled out a small slip of paper, handing it to him. "There's a man. He knows more than I do. He'll help you. But you have to be discreet." John glanced at the paper. A name and address were scrawled in shaky handwriting. "And what if this is a trap?" he asked, his voice low. She shook her head. It's not. But if you go to the wrong people, or if you move too fast, they'll disappear again. And this time, you'll never find her. John clenched his jaw, his emotions in turmoil. This woman was his only lead. But could he trust her? Why should I believe you? He asked, his voice raw with desperation. How do I know you're not playing me like everyone else? The woman's eyes locked onto his. Because I know what you're feeling, she said softly. I know the pain of losing someone, and I don't want you to lose her forever. For a moment, they stood in silence, the weight of her words sinking in. John's mind churned with fear, doubt, and the tiniest flicker of hope. Be careful, John, she whispered, backing away. They're always watching. Before he could say another word, the woman turned and disappeared into the shadows, leaving John alone on the bridge, clutching the photo of his daughter. He looked down at it again, his heart racing. Emily was out there. He was sure of it now, and no matter what it took, he was going to find her. The drive back to the city felt like an eternity. John's thoughts raced faster than the speeding car, weaving between fear, hope, and anger. He couldn't shake the image of Emily's face in the photograph, older but still undeniably his daughter. 10 years. She had been alive this whole time. But where? And why hadn't he found her? When John finally reached his penthouse, he barely noticed the grandeur of his surroundings. The high ceilings, the sleek furniture, the expansive view of the city below. It all faded into the background. His mind was consumed by the mysterious woman's warning and the note she had handed him. A name and an address. His only clue. Dropping his keys on the kitchen counter, he pulled out the small slip of paper from his pocket and read the scrawled writing again. David Hoffman, 244 Palmer Avenue. John paced the room, phone in hand, debating his next move. He had no idea who David Hoffman was, but if this man knew something about Emily's whereabouts, John couldn't afford to waste time. His instincts told him to go straight to Hoffman, demand answers. But something the woman had said lingered in his mind. They're always watching. Who were they? A group that had taken his daughter? It sounded like a paranoid conspiracy, but the photo of Emily, older, alive, made him question everything. He needed to be smart, cautious. Whoever had kept Emily hidden for all these years clearly had resources, power, and no hesitation in covering their tracks. He picked up the phone and called the one person he trusted to help him dig into this without attracting attention. Dominic Farrow, a private investigator he had worked with over the years. Dominic had been on the original case when Emily first disappeared, but even his relentless pursuit hadn't led them anywhere. This time, John hoped it would be different. The phone rang twice before Dominic answered. John, long time. What's going on? I need your help, John said, his voice tense. You sound serious. What is it? I've got a lead on Emily. The line went silent for a moment. What kind of lead? Someone came to me with information. She claims Emily is still alive. She gave me a name, an address. But I need you to check it out first. Why not just go yourself? Dominic asked, sounding skeptical. What's stopping you? John rubbed the back of his neck. This is bigger than I thought. Whoever took her, they're watching. I don't know who to trust, and I can't afford any mistakes. Dominic was quiet for a moment. All right, text me the address. I'll check it out and get back to you. Thanks, Dom, John said, already typing out the details. And be careful. I don't know who these people are, but they're dangerous. I'll be fine, Dominic replied. Just hang tight. I'll let you know what I find. After hanging up, John sat down at his desk, staring at the photo of Emily once again. His mind swirled with questions. Why would a group kidnap her? Was it for ransom? Revenge? Or something far more sinister? The more he thought about it, the more his stomach churned. There had to be more to this than he had ever imagined. A few hours passed, the silence in the penthouse interrupted only by the ticking of the clock on the wall. Each minute stretched longer than the last as John waited for Dominic's call. Finally, his phone buzzed. John, you need to see this, Dominic said on the other end, his voice tense. I'm sending you a photo. John's phone vibrated again, and he opened the image. It was a snapshot of the building at 244 Palmer Avenue, a rundown, nondescript warehouse on the edge of the city. The kind of place no one would pay attention to, perfect for hiding something or someone. There's no way this is a simple address, Dominic continued. The building's completely off the grid. No official ownership records, no registered business. It's like it doesn't exist. John frowned, feeling the unease growing in his chest. Did you go inside? I tried, Dominic replied, but the place is locked up tighter than a fortress. Heavy security on all entrances, cameras, keypads, the works. Whoever's running this place, they don't want anyone getting in. John's pulse quickened. This wasn't just a clue. This was the first real sign that someone was actively keeping Emily hidden. So what now? We'll need more time to figure out how to approach this, Dominic said. I can run a deeper background check on anyone associated with that location, see if we can find a way in. John hesitated. Every fiber of his being wanted to storm the place, tear down the walls, and find his daughter. But logic told him that would only put her in more danger. Do it, and keep me updated. Will do, Dominic said. And John, don't get too close to this. Not yet. John hung up, his mind spinning. He knew Dominic was right, but the idea of waiting, of sitting back while Emily could be in danger, made his skin crawl. He stood up, pacing again, the ticking clock only fueling his frustration. Hours passed, and despite the late hour, sleep was impossible. He found himself staring out the massive windows, the city lights flickering below him like tiny stars. It all felt so distant. His world of wealth, success, and power, when all he wanted was to find his daughter. Suddenly, his phone buzzed again. Another message from an unknown number. You're getting too close. Back off, or you'll regret it. John's blood ran cold. He gripped the phone tightly, his mind racing. Was this from the group that had taken Emily? Were they watching his every move? He quickly called Dominic, but it went straight to voicemail. Something wasn't right. With his heart pounding, John walked over to the window, looking out into the darkness. He felt exposed, vulnerable, like the eyes of the world were on him. And then, down on the street below, he saw it. A black car parked just outside his building, its engine idling. They were watching. John stared down at the black car parked across the street, its headlights dim but unmistakably focused on his building. His heart thudded in his chest. Were they watching him? His mind flashed back to the mysterious woman's warning. They're always watching. He quickly moved away from the window, pulling the curtains closed, shutting himself off from view. He couldn't afford to be reckless, not now. He had come too far, and Emily might still be out there. With the walls closing in around him, John dialed Dominic's number again. Straight to voicemail. The gnawing anxiety in his chest grew sharper. Dominic never missed a check-in, especially not when they were on a lead this important. Something had to be wrong. John's thoughts spiraled into fear. Could they have gotten to him? Had Dominic uncovered something he wasn't supposed to? He tried the number again, but still no answer. He had to find out what was going on. Without wasting another second, John grabbed his coat and rushed out of the penthouse. His mind raced, his instinct screaming at him to stop, to wait for more information. But he couldn't. He needed answers. As the elevator descended, his phone buzzed again. A message from another unknown number. We warned you. Stop now. John's heart pounded as he stepped into the underground parking garage. The space was eerily quiet, the only sound his hurried footsteps echoing against the concrete walls. He reached his car and paused, scanning the dimly lit garage for any sign of movement. There, in the far corner of the garage, a figure stood in the shadows. John's muscles tensed. He kept his hand on the door handle, his eyes locked on the shadowy figure. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice sharp, breaking the silence. The figure stepped forward into the light, a tall, imposing man in a black coat. John didn't recognize him, but there was something about his calm, deliberate movements that set off alarms in John's mind. This wasn't a chance encounter. "We told you to stop, Mr. Blake," the man said, his voice low and controlled. "This isn't a game you want to play." John's jaw clenched. "Who are you? And what do you know about my daughter?" The man smiled, a cold, calculating smile. "Emily Blake isn't your concern anymore. She's gone. Let her stay that way, or you'll regret it. John's anger flared. He took a step toward the man, his fists clenched. You don't get to tell me what's my concern. Where is she? The man's smile faded. His eyes narrowed, his tone turning icy. You don't understand what you're up against, Mr. Blake. If you keep pushing, you won't just lose your daughter. You'll lose everything. John's breath caught in his throat. His instincts told him to fight, to lash out, but a deeper, more chilling fear crept in. This wasn't just a random threat. These people knew who he was, what he had at stake, and they were willing to use it against him. Before he could respond, the man took a step back, blending into the shadows once again. Walk away, Blake. This is your last warning. John lunged forward, but the man was already gone, slipping into the darkness of the garage. His footsteps echoed briefly before disappearing completely. Shaken, John leaned against his car, trying to calm his racing heart. He had never felt so powerless, so completely outmatched. Whoever these people were, they had resources, powerful ones. They were always one step ahead, and now Dominic was missing. John pulled out his phone and texted Dominic again. No response. Panic gnawed at the edge of his thoughts, but he couldn't give in to fear. He needed a plan. Suddenly, his phone buzzed again. But this time it wasn't from an unknown number. It was Dominic. Come to the office. Now. It's urgent. John wasted no time. He jumped into his car and peeled out of the garage, weaving through the city streets with a singular focus. The world outside blurred past him as he drove, the weight of the mysterious man's words heavy on his shoulders. They had eyes on him. Every move he made, they were watching. But now, Dominic had something urgent, something that might finally bring clarity to this shadowy conspiracy. Within minutes, John arrived at Dominic's office. He hurried up the steps and through the door, the sound of his footsteps the only noise in the empty hallway. The office was dark, a single light glowing from under Dominic's door. John knocked once, then pushed the door open. Dominic was at his desk, his face pale, and the room was filled with papers strewn across the desk, as if he had been frantically working on something. His eyes flicked up to meet John's, and John could see the tension etched into every line on his face. You okay? John asked, stepping in and closing the door behind him. Dominic shook his head, his voice barely above a whisper. John, it's worse than we thought. John's stomach dropped. What do you mean? Dominic slid a folder across the desk, his hands shaking slightly. I dug deeper into that address, 244 Palmer Avenue. It's not just some random warehouse. It's connected to something bigger, much bigger. John opened the folder, flipping through the pages. There were names, business transactions, and hidden links to shell companies. Companies that tied directly back to powerful figures in the city, people John had crossed paths with over the years in his business dealings. But what caught his attention was a single document, an internal memo from a company he recognized. Jensen Pharmaceuticals. John's pulse quickened. This can't be right, he muttered, scanning the document again. Jensen Pharmaceuticals is one of my oldest business partners. Dominic nodded grimly. That's what makes it so dangerous. They've been using their facilities as a front for something else, something they don't want the public to know about. John's mind raced. Could his own business partners have been involved in Emily's disappearance? It seemed impossible, but the evidence was right in front of him. Why would they take her? John asked, his voice strained. What do they want with my daughter? Dominic looked him square in the eye, his face grim. Because they needed her for an experiment. A human trial they've been running off the books for years. John felt the blood drain from his face. An experiment? His daughter, his Emily, had been taken for some secretive pharmaceutical trial? Dominic leaned forward, his voice urgent. John, this goes all the way to the top. They've got powerful people protecting them. If you go after them, they'll come for you with everything they've got. John sat in stunned silence, the pieces of the puzzle finally clicking into place. Jensen Pharmaceuticals, the shady warehouse, the group that had been watching him. They had taken Emily, experimented on her. And now, after all these years, they were willing to destroy anyone who got too close to the truth. John clenched his fists, rage boiling beneath the surface. I don't care how powerful they are. I'm not stopping until I get her back. John sat in Dominic's dimly lit office, his mind spinning with the revelations laid out before him. The idea that his trusted business partners at Janssen Pharmaceuticals could be behind Emily's disappearance, and the thought of her being used in some kind of experiment, was almost too much to bear. But the evidence was undeniable. His hands trembled as he clenched the document, rage and disbelief warring within him. He stood abruptly, pacing the room, his pulse hammering in his ears. "This can't be happening," he muttered. "How could they keep this hidden for so long?" Dominic leaned back in his chair, exhaustion etched into his features. "These are powerful people, John. People with money, influence, and connections in all the right places. They've been careful. They've covered their tracks. That's why you haven't found anything for the last 10 years. John stopped pacing, staring blankly at the wall. He felt a hollow ache in his chest, like a piece of him had been ripped away. How could he have been so blind? He had worked with Janssen Pharmaceuticals for years, shaken hands with their executives, celebrated million-dollar deals with them. They had been right there, hiding in plain sight, while his daughter had been suffering in the shadows. "Who else knows about this?" John asked, his voice strained. "Who else is involved?" Dominic hesitated, then leaned forward, lowering his voice. "That's the thing. There's one more name tied to this, someone close to you." John felt the floor drop from under him. "Who?" he demanded, the hairs on the back of his neck standing up. Dominic slid another piece of paper across the desk, a copy of a wire transfer receipt. The name on the receiving end was one John knew all too well, Charles Langston. John's eyes widened, shock turning to cold fury. Charles? He almost couldn't believe what he was seeing. Charles Langston, his best friend of over 20 years, his confidant throughout Emily's disappearance, had been working with Janssen Pharmaceuticals? "There's more," Dominic said quietly, pulling out another file. "I traced Charles's financials, and he's been receiving payments from a shell company tied to Janssen for years. It started just before Emily disappeared, I think." But John cut him off, the realization dawning like a sledgehammer to the chest. He knew. He's known all along. His breath came in shallow gasps as the full weight of the betrayal hit him. Charles had been there the night Emily vanished. He had comforted John through every failed lead, pretended to support him, all while pocketing money from the very people who had taken his daughter. "How could I have been so blind?" John whispered, more to himself than to Dominic. His hands clenched into fists, shaking with anger. "I trusted him." Dominic stood and placed a hand on John's shoulder, his voice steady but urgent. "Listen, John. I know this is a lot to take in, but you need to stay focused. Charles is deep in this. If you confront him now, he'll know we're onto him, and he'll alert Janssen. You need to play this smart." John nodded, though his blood boiled at the thought of staying silent any longer. He had trusted Charles with everything, with his life, and now he realized that trust had been a deadly mistake. But Dominic was right. If Charles was involved with Janssen, then he had connections that could ruin any chance John had of finding Emily. Forcing himself to think clearly, John asked, "What's the next step?" "We need to gather more concrete evidence," Dominic replied. "Something we can use to expose them. I'll keep digging into Charles and Janssen's operations. In the meantime, you need to act like you don't know anything. Keep up appearances. Let him think everything's normal." John wanted to protest, to go straight to Charles's house and demand answers. But he swallowed his anger. "Fine," he muttered through gritted teeth. "But the moment you find something, I'm going after him." Dominic nodded. "We'll get them, John. But you have to be patient." John left Dominic's office, the cool night air hitting him like a slap to the face. He got into his car, but instead of driving home, he sat there in silence, staring at the steering wheel. His mind kept flashing back to Charles. Every conversation, every comforting word, every moment they'd shared in the years since Emily had disappeared. Had it all been a lie? He couldn't wrap his head around it. Charles had been like a brother to him. How could he have betrayed him in such a monstrous way? Suddenly, his phone buzzed on the passenger seat. He glanced at the screen, his heart racing when he saw the name. Charles Langston. The timing couldn't have been more chilling. His hands trembled as he answered the call, struggling to keep his voice steady. Charles, he said, forcing a casual tone. John, hey? Charles's voice came through the line, friendly as always. I was just calling to check on you. You seemed a bit off at lunch yesterday. Everything okay? John swallowed hard, every word from Charles now feeling like a blade to the chest. He forced a smile into his voice. Yeah, I'm fine. Just work stuff. You sure? Charles pressed, his concerns sounding genuine. You've been under a lot of pressure lately. If there's anything I can do to help? John gripped the phone tighter, his knuckles white. The audacity of it, pretending to care after everything he had done. But John couldn't let his emotions slip. Not yet. No, I'm good, John said, keeping his voice calm. I appreciate it, though. Well, let me know if you want to grab a drink this weekend. I've got some news about a new investment I want to run by you. Big opportunity. Yeah, sure. I'll let you know, John replied, his voice feeling hollow. As he hung up, his stomach churned. He had just spoken to the man responsible for his daughter's suffering, the man who had orchestrated a decade of lies. And now, he had to act as though nothing had changed. But inside, everything had changed. John wasn't going to let Charles, or anyone else, get away with this. For the first time in years, he felt the fires of vengeance burning inside him. They had taken his daughter. They had taken 10 years of his life. And now, John Blake was going to take them down, no matter what it cost him. John barely slept that night. He lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling, his mind churning with thoughts of betrayal and revenge. The darkness around him mirrored the emptiness inside, an aching hollow that had formed when he first realized Charles had been a part of the nightmare that stole his daughter. Every time John closed his eyes, he saw Charles's face, his old friend, his brother in arms, smiling, lying, pretending to care while secretly working with the people who had taken Emily. By the time the first rays of dawn crept through the windows, John had made up his mind. He couldn't wait any longer. He needed to act. John pulled himself out of bed and stared into the bathroom mirror. His eyes were bloodshot, dark circles forming beneath them. The man staring back at him was a stranger, a man consumed by anger, desperation, and a burning need for justice. He splashed water on his face, trying to shake off the exhaustion that clung to him, and got dressed. As he left his penthouse, the city outside was already alive with morning traffic. The world carried on, oblivious to the storm building inside him. He didn't have time for that. He needed answers, and he needed them now. First stop, Dominic. He needed more information before confronting Charles, something to pin him down. His phone buzzed as he was about to text Dominic, an incoming call. It was Dominic. John. Dominic's voice crackled through the line, sounding tense. We need to talk. I've got more on Charles, and it's worse than we thought. Where are you? John asked immediately. Meet me at the coffee shop on 5th. It's safer if we're not seen at my office. On my way, John replied, hanging up. When John entered the small cafe on 5th Avenue, he immediately spotted Dominic sitting at a corner table, away from the window. The private investigator looked more tired than usual, his face lined with worry. He barely acknowledged John's arrival, motioning for him to sit down quickly. What's going on? John asked, sliding into the seat across from him. What did you find? Dominic slid a folder across the table, keeping his voice low. I dug deeper into Charles's finances, just like we talked about. I knew there had to be more, and I was right. Janssen Pharmaceuticals is just the tip of the iceberg. John opened the folder and scanned the documents inside. Bank records, transactions, and emails that linked Charles not only to Janssen but to other companies, all tied to a web of offshore accounts. It was a web of corruption that stretched far beyond anything John had anticipated. These are offshore shell companies, Dominic explained. He's been moving money around through them for years, all tied to the same pharmaceutical research group. The same group that has been conducting the experiments. John felt his stomach churn. So, it's not just Janssen? No. Dominic shook his head. It's bigger. A consortium of companies all working together. Janssen is the face, but there are other players behind the scenes, covering up their operations with layers of corporate smoke and mirrors. John's fists tightened on the table. And Charles has been working with them the whole time? Not just working with them, Dominic said darkly. Charles is one of the key players. He's on the board of the consortium. I found a private document showing his involvement going back years, before Emily disappeared. John's blood ran cold. His breath came in short gasps as he realized the depth of Charles's betrayal. It wasn't just about money. Charles had been an integral part of the very operation that had taken Emily. He wasn't a bystander. He was one of the orchestrators. How long have you known? John asked, barely containing the fury in his voice. I found out late last night, Dominic replied, his voice cautious. John, you need to understand. These people play dirty. If we're going to take them down, we need to be smart. You can't just confront Charles without more leverage. If you go after him now, he'll bury us both. John stared at the documents, feeling the rage bubbling beneath the surface. I don't care about smart, he said coldly. I want him to pay. He's been sitting in my home, lying to my face for years, pretending to be my friend. He helped take my daughter. Dominic leaned forward, his expression grave. I understand, but this isn't just about you or Charles anymore. If you push too hard, too fast, they'll cover their tracks, and you'll never find Emily. John knew Dominic was right. The burning desire for vengeance had been clouding his judgment, but he couldn't afford to lose focus. Emily was still out there, and as much as he wanted to rip Charles apart, he needed to think about the bigger picture. Okay, John said, taking a deep breath. What do we do next? We need proof that ties Charles directly to Emily's disappearance, Dominic replied. I'm still working on uncovering more about the experiments, but we need something solid that we can use to expose him, something that'll blow this wide open. John nodded. Where do we start? Dominic glanced around the cafe, lowering his voice even further. Charles has a private property upstate, a secluded estate. It's where he meets with the other members of the consortium. I've traced several transactions and suspicious travel logs that lead back to that location. If they're keeping anything off the books, it'll be there. John's heart pounded. So we go there. Dominic hesitated. We need to be careful. It's likely heavily guarded, and if they catch wind of us snooping around, it could get dangerous. But if we can find something, anything, that ties him to the experiments, we can take it to the authorities. John's mind was already made up. He didn't care about the risks. If this was where Charles was hiding the truth, then that's where he needed to be. When do we leave? Dominic sighed, knowing John wouldn't back down. Tonight. We'll go in after dark, get in, and get out as quickly as possible. That night, John and Dominic drove upstate under the cover of darkness. The quiet hum of the engine was the only sound as they sped down the winding, desolate roads toward Charles's estate. John's heart raced with anticipation. He had spent years looking for answers, and now he was closer than ever. As they approached the property, the dense forest closed in around them, the headlights cutting through the trees. The estate was vast, sprawling over acres of land, with a grand mansion sitting at the center like a fortress. High walls and security cameras dotted the perimeter, making it clear that Charles was protecting more than just his privacy. Dominic parked the car a short distance away, hidden behind a line of trees. They stepped out into the cool night air, the silence almost deafening. We'll go around the back, Dominic whispered, pointing to a gap in the fence where the security was less intense. Stay close and keep quiet. John nodded, his pulse quickening as they moved toward the estate. His mind raced with thoughts of Emily, of Charles, of the answers that waited for him just beyond those walls. They slipped through the gap in the fence, carefully avoiding the cameras as they crept closer to the mansion. The estate was eerily quiet, the windows dark. But John knew better than to assume no one was there. Over here, Dominic whispered, leading him toward a side entrance. They picked the lock and slipped inside, finding themselves in a small, dimly lit hallway. John's heart pounded in his chest as they moved deeper into the house, their footsteps silent on the marble floors. They passed through rooms filled with expensive furniture, art, and the trappings of wealth and power, but none of it mattered. They were looking for something far more important. Finally, they reached a door that was locked with a keypad. This is it, Dominic whispered. This has to be where he's keeping the real files. John's hands trembled as Dominic worked on the keypad, overriding the system. The door clicked open, revealing a small office lined with shelves and a computer sitting on the desk. "Search everything," Dominic said, pulling out a flash drive to download the files from the computer. John rifled through the drawers, his heart racing. And then, buried beneath a stack of papers, he found it, an old photo of Emily. She was sitting in a sterile-looking room, older than she had been in the last photo, but unmistakably Emily. Her eyes looked hollow, her face pale. John's throat tightened as he stared at the image. Emily, his daughter, alive but trapped in some hellish nightmare. Before he could process it further, Dominic hissed, "We need to go. Now." John pocketed the photo, and they slipped out of the office just as the distant sound of footsteps echoed through the halls. They moved quickly, darting through the house and back out into the night. As they drove away from the estate, John clutched the photo tightly, his mind swirling with fear, anger, and determination. They were close now. He could feel it. And no matter what it took, he was going to bring Emily home. The drive back from Charles's estate was tense and silent, the weight of their discovery heavy between them. John couldn't take his eyes off the photo of Emily, his daughter, staring back at him from that cold, sterile room. She looked older, tired, and worn, nothing like the vibrant little girl he remembered. His heart clenched at the sight of her, both a painful reminder of the years lost and a flicker of hope. She was alive. Dominic glanced over at John as they drove, his expression grim. "We're getting close," he said quietly. "But this isn't over. If Charles knows we've been there, things will escalate. We need to move fast, and we need something solid to take him down." John barely nodded, his thoughts consumed by the image of Emily. "We need to get her back," he muttered. "We need to bring her home." "We will," Dominic replied. "But first, we need to figure out exactly where she is." John turned toward him, his brow furrowed. "What do you mean? We know Charles is involved." "He's involved, but he's not keeping her at that estate," Dominic interrupted. "That photo is old. She's somewhere else now. We need to find the facility where they're holding her." John clenched his jaw, his fists tightening around the photo. Every second felt like an eternity, every moment away from Emily a torment. "So how do we find her?" he asked, his voice tense with desperation. Dominic pulled out the flash drive he had used to download files from Charles's computer. "This," he said, holding it up. "I managed to get everything off his system before we left. There should be something in here. Records, locations, something that'll lead us to her." John exhaled, his grip on the photo loosening. He couldn't afford to lose hope now. They were so close. "When can you go through it?" he asked. "I'll start tonight," Dominic said, his voice steady. "But we need to be careful. Once Charles realizes we've breached his security, he'll go into damage control. He'll hide everything. We need to hit him fast, and we need to be smart." John nodded, though every part of him wanted to storm every building and facility linked to Charles and tear them apart until he found Emily. But he knew Dominic was right. They couldn't afford any mistakes now. Later that night, John sat in his penthouse, the silence pressing in on him. The photo of Emily lay on the table in front of him, and he couldn't tear his eyes away from it. His mind replayed every moment of her disappearance, every step he had taken, every misstep that had brought him to this point. And now, after all these years, the truth was finally within reach. His phone buzzed, jolting him out of his thoughts. It was Dominic. "I've got something," Dominic said, his voice low but urgent. "Come over now." John grabbed his coat and rushed out the door, his heart pounding. He arrived at Dominic's office in record time, the familiar tension knotting his stomach as he stepped inside. Dominic was already at his desk, the computer screen glowing with lines of data. "I found the facility," he said without preamble. "It's a private research lab, hidden under the radar. No official records, no public access. But it's real." John's heart skipped a beat. "Where is it?" Dominic turned the screen toward him, showing a map with a marked location. "It's upstate, even more remote than Charles's estate. This is where they've been keeping the subjects of their experiments." "And John," he paused, looking at him with grim intensity, "it's not just Emily. There are others." John's blood ran cold. "Others?" Dominic nodded, scrolling through the files on the screen. They've been running these experiments for years on multiple people, mostly children. Emily was one of the first, but they've continued, and they've been covering it up the whole time. John's hands shook with rage. The thought of his daughter and other innocent children being subjected to these horrors was too much to bear. "We need to get her out of there," he said, his voice barely controlled. "Now." Dominic nodded. "I've already started planning. We can't go to the authorities, not yet. They're in too deep with Jensen and the consortium. If we alert them, they'll tip off Charles and the others. We'll lose everything." John felt the weight of those words. He had never felt so powerless in his life. "So what do we do?" "We go in ourselves," Dominic said, his voice calm but firm. "I've got contacts, people who can help us. It won't be easy, and it won't be safe, but it's the only way." John didn't hesitate. "I'll do whatever it takes. Just tell me what we need." The plan came together faster than John expected. Dominic's contacts were skilled, ex-military types who specialized in getting in and out of places unnoticed. They spent the next day preparing, mapping out the facility, gathering equipment, and setting up the operation. The clock was ticking, and they knew it was only a matter of time before Charles realized they had been to his estate. By the time night fell again, they were ready. John stood in a dark alley, his heart pounding in his chest, surrounded by Dominic and the small team of operatives they had assembled. The location of the research facility was secluded, tucked away deep in the woods, but they had the element of surprise. And John had something else driving him, the knowledge that his daughter was there, somewhere inside. Dominic handed him an earpiece. "Remember, stick with the plan. We get in, find Emily, and get out. No unnecessary risks." John nodded, though his mind was focused only on Emily. He couldn't fail her again. They moved swiftly through the dense forest, using the cover of darkness to their advantage. The facility loomed ahead, a modern, unmarked building with high security, fences, cameras, guards. It looked like a fortress, but to John, it was a prison. A prison where his daughter had been trapped for a decade. Dominic signaled for the team to move in. The operatives worked quickly, disabling the security systems, cutting through the fence, and neutralizing the guards with silent precision. John's heart raced as they approached the main entrance, every second bringing him closer to Emily. They slipped inside, the hallways cold and sterile, lit by harsh fluorescent lights. The team moved with purpose, clearing rooms as they advanced, while John's pulse quickened with every step. And then they found it, a locked door with a keypad, just like the one at Charles's estate. "This is it," Dominic whispered, working on the keypad. "She's inside." John's breath caught in his throat as the door clicked open. He pushed past Dominic, stepping into the dimly lit room. There she was, Emily. She was lying on a small bed, her arms strapped down, her face pale but unmistakably hers. John's heart broke at the sight of her once bright eyes now dull and distant. He rushed to her side, unstrapping her and pulling her into his arms. "Emily," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm here. I've got you." Her eyes fluttered open, barely registering him. But there was recognition, a flicker of life, a spark of the girl he had lost so long ago. "Dad," she whispered, her voice weak and fragile. Tears filled John's eyes as he held her tightly. "I'm here, Emily. I'm taking you home." But before they could move, alarms blared through the facility, and Dominic's voice crackled through John's earpiece. "John, we've got company. We need to move. Now." John's heart pounded as he scooped Emily into his arms. He wasn't going to lose her again. Not now, not ever. The blaring alarm sent John's pulse racing as he cradled Emily in his arms. She felt so light, so fragile, as if the years in that cold facility had drained the life from her. But her faint whisper of "Dad" was enough to ignite a fire within him. He was not leaving without her. Dominic's voice crackled urgently through the earpiece. "John, we've got armed guards converging on your position. You need to get out now." John looked down at Emily, her eyes half closed, barely clinging to consciousness. "We're getting out of here," he whispered, more to himself than to her, as he adjusted her weight in his arms and started moving toward the door. Dominic and the team were already in action, securing the hallway, covering John's exit. The building seemed to buzz with activity as guards scrambled toward them. The previously sterile and quiet facility had erupted into chaos, the alarm echoing through every corner. Dominic appeared by John's side, motioning to the team. "We're heading for the back exit. There's an access tunnel that leads out into the forest. It's our best shot." John nodded, his mind focused on one thing: getting Emily out of there safely. As they moved swiftly through the corridors, John kept his eyes locked on the path ahead, but his heart remained with his daughter, lying limp in his arms. He had found her, but the battle was far from over. The sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway as they turned a corner. Guards, heavily armed, were closing in fast. "Take cover," Dominic barked, shoving John and Emily behind a set of metal storage cabinets. Gunfire erupted, the deafening sound bouncing off the walls as Dominic and the team returned fire. John's heart pounded in his chest as he shielded Emily, her breathing shallow but steady. He felt utterly helpless, watching as the operatives risked their lives to hold back the tide of guards. "Hold the line," Dominic shouted, his voice strained as the firefight intensified. "John, we need to move now. We can't hold them off much longer." John gritted his teeth, his determination solidifying. He looked down at Emily, brushing her hair from her face. "Stay with me, sweetheart," he whispered. "We're almost out of here." Dominic signaled, and the team pushed forward, creating a narrow path for John to escape. He surged forward, carrying Emily through the chaos. Every muscle in his body ached, but the adrenaline kept him moving, kept him focused on one goal: freedom. They reached the back of the facility, where Dominic had pinpointed an access tunnel. The team cleared the entrance, and one of the operatives motioned for John to follow. "This way. The tunnel will take us a quarter-mile out into the forest. We can regroup there." John hesitated for just a second, glancing back at the facility. He had gotten Emily out, but the anger still boiled beneath the surface. The people who had taken her, who had done this to her, were still in power. Charles was still out there. They were still operating. And if he didn't act fast, they would cover their tracks. But Emily needed him. He couldn't risk losing her again. He carried her into the tunnel, the darkness swallowing them as they moved deeper underground. The air was cold, damp, and the faint echo of gunfire still reverberated from the facility above. Every step felt like an eternity, the weight of Emily in his arms reminding him just how fragile the situation was. Suddenly, a new voice crackled in John's earpiece. "You think you can just take her?" John froze. It was Charles. His cold, familiar voice sent a chill down John's spine. "You've been playing a dangerous game, John," Charles continued, his tone dark and menacing. "I warned you to back off. You should have listened." John's grip tightened on Emily. He didn't respond, pushing forward with renewed urgency, but Charles's voice continued, mocking him. "You're not getting away with this. You think you've won because you found her? You have no idea what you've stepped into. This is so much bigger than you, John. You can't beat us." John's heart pounded with rage. He wanted to scream at Charles, to confront him, to make him pay for everything he had done. But now wasn't the time. Now, he needed to focus on Emily, on getting her to safety. Dominic's voice cut in. "Ignore him, John. Keep moving. We're almost at the exit." As they neared the end of the tunnel, a faint light appeared in the distance, signaling their way out. John's heart raced with hope, but as they approached the exit, Dominic stopped abruptly, his face twisted with concern. "John," Dominic whispered, his hand on John's arm. "We've got a problem." John followed Dominic's gaze. Outside, just beyond the tunnel exit, a line of black SUVs waited, headlights cutting through the darkness. Armed men stood at the ready, their faces shadowed but their intentions clear. They had been waiting for them. "They're trying to cut us off," Dominic muttered. "They know we're here." John's mind raced. They were trapped. Charles's men were closing in from both sides. There was no way out, no way to escape without a fight. And with Emily in his arms, he couldn't risk an all-out confrontation. "What do we do?" John asked, his voice tight with fear and frustration. Dominic scanned the area, his mind working fast. "We need a diversion," he said. "Something to draw their attention away from us so we can get Emily out of here." John looked down at Emily, her face pale, her breathing weak. Every second felt like a ticking bomb, the weight of his daughter's life in his hands. He wasn't going to let Charles win. He wasn't going to let anyone take her away again. Suddenly, one of the operatives whispered urgently, "I can do it. I'll draw them off." John's eyes widened. "What? No." The operative, a woman with steely eyes and a determined expression, shook her head. "You need to get her out of here. I'll buy you time." Before John could argue, she was already moving. She slipped out of the tunnel, heading straight toward the SUVs, her figure barely a blur in the darkness. Moments later, gunfire erupted. The guards shouted, their attention drawn toward the gunfight that had broken out. It was their chance. "Go!" Dominic shouted, pushing John toward the tree line. "This is your window." John ran, Emily held tightly in his arms, his legs burning as he sprinted through the woods. The sound of the gunfire faded behind them as they weaved through the trees, heading for the extraction point Dominic had arranged. By the time they reached the edge of the forest, John's lungs burned, his arms aching from the weight of carrying Emily. But they had made it. A helicopter waited just beyond the clearing, its blades spinning, ready for takeoff. Dominic was right behind him, breathless but steady. "Get her on the chopper, John. I'll cover you." John nodded, rushing toward the helicopter, his heart pounding. He climbed in, carefully laying Emily down across the seat. "Stay with me, Emily," he whispered, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "We're almost home." The helicopter's engine roared to life, and as the rotors spun faster, lifting them off the ground, John felt the weight of the past 10 years begin to lift. They were getting out. Emily was coming home. As they ascended into the night sky, John glanced down at the forest below, the chaos of the facility shrinking into the distance. But even as they flew to safety, one thought remained in John's mind. Charles wasn't finished yet. This wasn't over. And John wouldn't stop until the people who had taken Emily and destroyed his life were brought to justice. The helicopter cut through the night sky, the rhythmic thrum of its blades a stark contrast to the chaos they had just left behind. John sat beside Emily, his heart pounding as he watched her, unconscious but alive, her chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. For the first time in 10 years, he had his daughter back. But the nightmare wasn't over, not yet. Dominic sat across from him, his face tight with worry. "She needs medical attention, fast," he said, his voice barely audible above the roar of the helicopter. John nodded, his hand gently resting on Emily's. "We're almost there," he whispered to her, as much to reassure himself as her. "Just hold on." The helicopter began to descend, landing on the rooftop of a private clinic Dominic had arranged. A team of medics was already waiting as they touched down, rushing toward the chopper as soon as the doors opened. John lifted Emily into his arms and carried her, careful but swift, toward the waiting stretcher. "She's been through hell," John told the medics, his voice trembling. "Do whatever you need to do." The medics nodded, immediately working to stabilize her as they rushed her into the clinic. John followed, his heart in his throat, every fiber of his being focused on Emily. He had found her, saved her, but the trauma she had endured was written all over her fragile body. What had they done to her? What had those monsters at Jensen Pharmaceuticals put her through? Dominic caught up to John as they entered the clinic. "They'll take care of her, John. She's in good hands here." John nodded, though the hollow ache in his chest wouldn't fade. "What now?" he asked, his voice low. "Charles is still out there. They're all still out there." "We'll deal with that," Dominic said, his expression hardening. "But right now, you need to be here for Emily." John watched through the glass as the doctors worked on his daughter, the pain and anger inside him swelling. He had come so close to losing her forever. He had trusted people like Charles, and they had betrayed him, turned his life into a nightmare. But he wasn't finished. Not yet. Hours passed, and John barely moved from the waiting area, his eyes fixed on the door to the operating room. He couldn't shake the image of Emily strapped to that bed in the facility, her face pale, her spirit broken. For his hand, her fingers weak but warm. I thought I'd never see you again," she whispered, her voice shaking. John gently squeezed her hand, his heart breaking at the pain in her voice. "You're safe now. I've got you." They sat there in silence for a while, the weight of the years and the suffering too much to put into words. But in that moment, John knew that no matter what came next, they had each other. That was all that mattered. Later that evening, after Emily had fallen asleep, John stepped out of the room to find Dominic waiting in the hallway. "She's going to be okay," John said quietly, his voice still thick with emotion. Dominic nodded. "Good. But we've still got work to do." John's expression darkened. "Charles." "Yes," Dominic said, his face grim. "We can't let him get away with this. Or the people at Jensen Pharmaceuticals." John clenched his fists, the familiar rage burning through him again. He had spent a decade chasing shadows, trusting the wrong people, and now that he had found Emily, he couldn't rest until those responsible for her suffering were brought to justice. "Did you find anything else?" John asked. Dominic handed him a small flash drive. "This was in the files we pulled from the facility. It's everything: documents, records, video footage. Enough to expose Charles and the entire operation." John stared at the drive, feeling the weight of it in his hand. This was it, the proof they needed to destroy Charles and bring down the entire conspiracy that had taken Emily. But as he looked at the drive, a thought crossed his mind. Destroying Charles wouldn't be enough. He wanted more than justice. He wanted revenge. "What's the plan?" John asked, his voice cold and determined. "We release the information to the press," Dominic said. "Expose them for what they've done. Once the public knows, Jensen and everyone involved will be ruined. There won't be anywhere for them to hide." John nodded, though a darker part of him wanted something more personal, more final. Charles had taken everything from him. Ruining his reputation didn't feel like enough. But for now, he would settle for destroying everything Charles had built. The next morning, the story broke. Major news outlets around the world published the damning evidence of illegal human experimentation funded and orchestrated by Jensen Pharmaceuticals, with Charles Langston at the center of it all. The headlines exploded, and within hours, the entire consortium that had been covering up their crimes was exposed. John sat by Emily's side, watching the news unfold on the small television in her room. The images of Charles being arrested flashed across the screen, his smug face replaced with one of shock and fear as the authorities led him away in handcuffs. The world now knew the truth. "Is it over?" Emily asked softly, her voice still weak. John turned to her, his eyes filled with love and determination. "It's over, sweetheart. They can't hurt us anymore." Emily smiled faintly, though the years of pain were still etched on her face. "Thank you, Dad, for finding me." John's heart swelled with emotion as he leaned down, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead. "I'll always find you, Emily. Always." But as the world celebrated the downfall of Jensen Pharmaceuticals and Charles Langston, John knew that the pain of the past would linger. He had brought down the men who had taken his daughter, but the scars they had left behind would take a lifetime to heal. For now, though, John had Emily back, and that was enough. As they sat together in the quiet of the hospital room, John felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a long time: hope. Whatever the future held, they would face it together.